So last year I spent quite a few episodes talking about Stoicism, that ancient philosophy of the ancient Greeks and Romans that seems so appropriate in our modern world, and indeed has gained popularity in the modern world, just like ancient philosophies like Buddhism, as a form of philosophical practice rather than a particular belief system. And it turned out that the more we dug into Stoicism, the more there was to find. And that's, of course, because it's not gathering dust back there in the ancient world. There have been plenty modern philosophers, modern commentators of other kinds who have had plenty to say about Stoicism and who have developed our ideas of it further. So what I wanted to do in this episode is first off remind you of the basic principles that Stoicism is based on. What are its absolutely core ideas that inform the practice of Stoic philosophy, and also look at some of the issues and problems with it in the modern world as we seek ways to level up and make it more appropriate and more modern to our world. But to start, we want to have a look at a quick reminder of what those very basic key principles actually are. Stoicism is based on three essential principles. The first one of those is that virtue is the highest good and nothing else could be exchanged for that. The second principle is that we should apply reason to everything in our lives. Following nature is usually what is meant by applying reason. What is the sensible, obvious, natural thing to do? And the third virtue is to concern yourself only with what is under your control and handle everything else with equanimity. Try and not be riled up or overexcited or sad or overreacting to things which are not under our control. And that idea of what is and isn't under our control is very key to Stoicism. But as I said, Stoicism also talks about virtue as the highest good and defines the four virtues that are essential to Stoicism. First of those is wisdom. Secondly, courage, to try and do the right thing in the face of whatever circumstances. The third one is justice, to treat every human being equally, fairly, and kindly. And the fourth one, temperance, to exercise moderation in all things. As we'll see, there are some issues in the modern world that arise out of that rather lofty, idealistic sounding language. Make no mistake, still very much something to aspire towards, but modern commentators have pointed out that some of those words might either be problematical or different in the modern world. It's for those kind of reasons that perhaps we need to look at Stoicism through a more modern lens. We'll get to that in a minute. Let's just remind ourselves of some of the key practices of the Stoics. So one of them is to always prepare for the worst. We heard that from Marcus last year when Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic Roman philosopher, emperor, told us that every morning when you get up you should remind yourself that the world is full of idiots and reprobates and people are going to do the most outlandish and stupid and anger-inspiring things and so on. And he could have so been speaking about our modern world or what happens the minute you jump onto social media. So prepare for the worst means expect that when you get onto Facebook you're going to be angry sooner or later, or depressed or upset about what people do. That's what it means to prepare for the worst. Another basic Stoic principle and practice is to be clear about your intentions. Know what you want, and pursuing that, keeping your goal in view, is what produces a balanced and calm mind. It's when we don't know what we want, when we're chopping and changing, when we don't know, we're not clear about our intentions, and when we have all sorts of expectations, that everything goes horribly wrong. So be clear, plan to the end, don't be overwhelmed, you'll get there, everything will be peaceable. It's interesting because that itself also applies to what I've been saying, even about, say, social media and so on. We get distracted by so many things. And it's that distraction that produces directionlessness. It's our multitasking that produces directionlessness. Our efforts to do many things at the same time, whether it's looking at a screen while having a conversation, or whether it's supposedly multitasking. We like to joke how women are good at multitasking and men are bad at it and so on. There are no human beings who are good at multitasking. Multitasking is something a computer does, but a brain fakes it, and in fact divides up our attention and our energies into lots of small pieces, which, if you think about it, is invariably going to lead to a bit of a confused result. The third Stoic practice is to be ruthless with what doesn't matter. That great Stoic philosopher Seneca said, time is so short, you're going to die soon, you could die tomorrow, you don't even know. So rather get on with what's important. And what's important is the things you do to advance your wisdom and knowledge and understanding as a human being. The wisdom and knowledge ultimately of yourself. So working on ourselves and trying to be our best selves is the most important thing. And Seneca says, spend most of your time doing that. Ask yourself, does it really matter in the greater scheme of things about so many of the other things you do, about so many of the other things you respond to on those social media? Does it really matter? You must be ruthless. Seneca reminds us, you will be dead soon. Stop wasting your time. Quite a good point. Of course, while Seneca might not have had social media, he seems to know about it, because he says the things which distract us and waste our time most are negative emotions like anger and overexcitement and things which actually don't concern us. So it's actually easier than we think. And finally, a fourth practice that I want to mention is to adjust to what really is going on. The way to harmonize with the world is to keep on adjusting yourself to it, not to impose your will on the world and then get frustrated and angry when it doesn't cooperate with you, because it doesn't. As he says, Seneca, you're only in control of yourself, concentrate on that. So similarly, don't respond to the world as if it's against you, because you should really be adjusting to it because you're not in control of it. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the Stoics recommend lots of reflection and journaling, writing in a journal every single day, as we learnt a couple of years ago on this show in our daily spiritual practices. So all those Stoic ideas look really great, but when we look at them through the modern lens, we need to adjust ourselves a little bit, also in order to make it easier to understand them and to apply them more successfully. It was Seneca, the great Stoic himself, who said, "Will I not walk in the footsteps of my predecessors? I will indeed use the ancient road. But if I find another route that is more direct and has fewer ups and downs, I will stake out that one." Those who advanced these ancient doctrines before us are not our masters, but our guides. And that is the key point in dealing with all ancient ideas. We must be guided by them, not mastered by them. In being guided by them, we must be careful not to stray too far away from the path, but we must ensure that that path is the most direct one available to us with the current knowledge and understanding that we have. One of the great modern critics who is a Stoic on Stoicism is Chuck Chakrapani, a contemporary philosopher. I don't think he'd call himself a philosopher, but at any rate, he writes extensively on Stoicism, and he points out that one of the problems in blindly following Stoicism is that some of its core tenets are based on Stoic physics. The beliefs about physics and logic and mathematics, those kinds of things were represented, human beings had conquered the world. And that's why in ancient times, things like language and grammar and mathematics were seen as spiritual subjects. They were part of what makes us human. So the idea of ancient metaphysics and the physics of the world, which was so linked together, consciousness and physics, which was so linked together, are all interesting, but not necessarily applicable or even true anymore. So Stoicism has physics and logic as its core features. But of course those are Stoic physics and logic, and there are logic and physics which date from 2,000 and more years ago, which we know for certain that the physics of 2,000 years ago is not the physics of today. And perhaps we should even be able to ask, unlike someone in a Roman school like Marcus himself, or following formally the traditions of philosophy, we should be entitled and able to ask, well, does that really even apply? Is it really relevant? In a world where they were trying to understand the world of physics as well, unifying philosophies, just like religion, unifying philosophies were sought. Religion tries to explain everything about the world, not just what you want to believe about God. So it's the same. Philosophies did the same, and Stoic philosophy did the same. It tries to explain everything about the world, not just how to behave with equanimity. So similarly, we must be comfortable with throwing some of that old stuff out, the old physics and metaphysics that doesn't actually apply. And in fact, it is the greatest Stoic of all that tells us to do just that. It's Epictetus, who's Marcus's teacher, who says, what do I care whether everything that exists is made up of atoms or indivisibles or fire and earth? Questions that are beyond our understanding, he says, we should ignore. It may well be that the human mind can't even grasp them. Even if you think they are perfectly understandable, what's the use of understanding them? Should we not say that those who think that those things are an essential part of a philosopher's knowledge are creating unwanted problems for themselves? Now you have to worry about the meaning of something metaphysical and the explanation of physics, when all you're trying to do is live your life as a human being. So Chakrapani and others point out that you can follow Stoic ethics and Stoic practices without having to refer to and draw on Stoic metaphysics or Stoic physics or whatever. Quite frankly, there is no evidence that proficiency in Stoic physics and Stoic logic and all of those things from the ancient world make anyone a better Stoic or a better understanding of philosophy than anyone else. I'm sure many of you have been reading some of the Stoics, and like me, would have found that every time they delve into all of that stuff, it becomes a little hazy and vague, and it's like, oh, do I really need to know this? And it acts as an obstacle. It makes you feel like I'm not understanding the philosophy. And modern commentators like Chakrapani are saying, be comfortable with eliminating those aspects that are not relevant anymore or are not relevant to furthering our understanding. One of the absolutely key matters that arises related to all of that is the words that the Stoics use. The words like virtue that I used earlier on, ethics, even words like God and nature have different meanings now than what they had before. And we tend to use translations. I mean, well, all we can do is read translations. Marcus wrote in Greek, even though he was Roman, ancient Greek. His words were later translated into Latin and, of course, into English. Generally, Greek was the language of science and philosophy. So that Greek has been translated at different times. You can compare two translations of any one of these great Stoics and find them to be completely different. And that's because we use language that we're going to understand. So trigger words like virtue and ethics and God are words which we need to step back from and realize we need to define what we mean by that, or we need to ask, is that relevant to my understanding? As Marcus himself says, ultimately Stoicism is a prescription for action, not just for some cosmic understanding. He even mocks and dismisses our obsession with theory and the theory behind things, and he says in the end it's the practice that matters. From Marcus he says, if the cucumber is bitter, throw it out. If there are brambles in the path, go around them. That's all you need to know. You don't need to understand why is the cucumber bitter or what it is about this path that makes it strewn with brambles. Don't demand to know why things exist. Be practical. Just follow them. A very practical point. Chakrapani points out, as we should realize, that there are many sources of Stoicism. There's no one authority like there is in some other philosophies. Even Platonism, of course, Plato is the philosophy. We can always go back to the source and say, but did Plato say that? Or is that what he really meant? We can go to Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus or any of them, but there isn't one authority. These are all people writing about an existing philosophy that, quite frankly, is a little bit older than them, many hundreds of years older than them. It arose out of the Greek philosopher Zeno in the 3rd century or so BC, hundreds of years before Marcus and Epictetus. And interestingly, although obviously they could read Greek, those Romans, the fact remains that of the Greek writings on Stoicism, almost nothing exists. About 2% is estimated. So actually, not only is there no one authority on Stoicism, but a lot of the original core ideas are probably lost. And similarly to that, the time that Stoicism flourished and the circumstances under which it flourished in Rome are of course very different to our own. Like I was saying earlier on, issues like you must do this, you must do that are really related to the culture that they're in, not always to the philosophy that they're talking about. And even when they are, we need to ask ourselves, is that applicable to us today? Why did they say that? And who says that's a Stoic belief anyway? These are all commentators writing about their own responses to the ancient philosophy. Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius themselves are writing in response, and their explanation for their contemporaries, just like I do for you here, or anyone writing about it today does, we're reinterpreting and recouching things to understand for ourselves. And we need to get back to the core idea of, is that useful to me, and what is the usefulness of that? So remembering that we have issues with language, that words have different meaning, that there was no overarching philosophy, that all the writers of philosophy adapted it to their circumstances. So some of what they say are circumstance-based, and ultimately, as Seneca tells us, be guided by, not mastered by. You have to ask yourself the relevance to your current situation, and you've got to really get down to the core practices. Chakrapani, he's the one who coined the term Stoic minimalism, and he says that stripping away all of those possibilities in different languages and constantly challenging that, we've got to focus on, firstly, concepts like God, nature, ethics, virtue must be understood in their modern thought equivalents rather than word equivalents. So for example, God still has a meaning in modern times as the word God. We refer to the deity. But to modern people, we often use a concept like the universe or nature, when actually an ancient person would have used the word God to describe that. The universe is the best example of that. I always hear that just as a modern word for God. What do people really mean when they say, the universe gave this to me, or the universe is telling me something? The universe is, a bunch of stars and galaxies and stuff. So it's just another word for God and another concept for God. So it's an example of use the modern concepts that you mean. Don't get stuck on ancient words like God, nature, virtue, and so on. And secondly, he says, at core, Stoicism is an ethical system. So look at the ethical system which stands on its own without having to be propped up by physics and metaphysics and social things and politics, like you have to vote in the Roman Empire. All of those rules of what a good Stoic would do, that isn't Stoicism, because a good Stoic asks himself. And that is Stoicism. And that's part of the idea of that Stoic minimalism. Indeed, the Stoics should be guided by an ethical approach. Certainly an ethical approach is the point of Stoicism, how to live an ethical life. But words like ethical are pregnant with ideas and meanings and philosophies and someone's idea versus someone else's idea. So this is what the Stoic minimalists like Chakrapani suggest. Strip it down, get to the core concepts and don't get hung up on words. So according to Chakrapani, what that leaves us with as some of those core concepts are, firstly, some things are up to us and some things are not. So we can achieve happiness by confining our thoughts, our actions, our behaviors to what is under our own control. There's that word happiness. Earlier on, a year ago or so, when I spoke about Stoicism, I mentioned that the magician Derren Brown wrote a book called Happy, and that's about how to achieve happiness, which is the core purpose, if you like, of Stoicism, and indeed of most other philosophies as well. That principle that we can achieve happiness by confining our thoughts and actions to things that are up to us and under our own control, and avoiding those things or not, contains everything we need to know in order to be happy. The wisdom needed to achieve happiness is that we cannot pursue happiness directly, but because if we do, it will have consequences. If we pursue happiness directly, thinking that's what's going to make me happy, and we go for that, we get involved in indulgence, in greed, in selfish behaviors, in attachment to things, in disappointments when things don't work out, to invariably going in the opposite direction, which is definitely not what we were trying to do. Directly going after happiness does not achieve happiness. So the modern Stoics point out you cannot achieve happiness by directly pursuing it. The way to achieve happiness is to practice excellence, to try and be as best as you can, to follow those basic principles that stop you getting into situations that make you unhappy, by not trying to control things that you're not in control over, especially other people. All of those basic things, not getting caught up in that stuff, is how we will find happiness. We shouldn't pursue happiness directly. We should remove what stands in the way of happiness. And as we remove those things, such as foolishness, such as addiction, such as desire and indulgence, such as cowardice, such as injustice, such as intemperance, lack of self-control. You could get many of those, and those are all drawn from traditional Stoic sources, those ideas. You can redefine those words and you can find the new words, but you know exactly what I mean. To achieve happiness, remove the things that stand in its way. And those things that stand in its way are the emotions and actions that you are not in control of. So, a much simpler approach, and that's why Chakrapani calls it Stoic minimalism. In future episodes, we'll be taking further looks at how the modern Stoics help us to understand how to contextualize and adapt some of this ancient wisdom. Well, it seems like the more we dig into that philosophy, the more there is to find. As much as we'd like to say, now we know, and there it all is, and now let's just get on with it, it just gets deeper and bigger. And I think that's the evidence that it is still a dynamic, living philosophy appropriate to us all. Join me here again next week when I'll be speaking to well-known local spiritual teacher and author Hilda de la Rosa about her latest book. You won't want to miss that one. See you then.